I finally realized my entire existence was just a transaction. My name is Kendra, and at 29 years old, I discovered that my loyalty was a currency my family had completely devalued. The nightmare began earlier that afternoon, during my parents' 35th wedding anniversary party at our sprawling horse farm in Lexington. My older sister looked spectacular in a custom silk gown that contrasted sharply with my wrinkled navy blazer because I had just spent 6 grueling hours fighting with customs officers to release our cargo. The photographer arranged us against the white stable gates for the official portrait, while guests watched from the terrace. I stepped into the frame next to my parents, hoping for a moment of unity after saving the business yet again, but the atmosphere shifted instantly. My sister turned to me with a cold smile and spoke loud enough for every wealthy guest to hear. "Kendra, could you please step outside the frame because your outfit is ruining the aesthetic? This is a family photo for the society pages, and it is really not the place for office staff." I looked at my parents for support, but they simply nodded in agreement while my younger brother let out a scoff of amusement from the corner. I did not make a scene or beg for my place in a family that clearly viewed me as an outsider. I simply stepped out of the frame without a word and walked straight toward the valet stand, while leaving them to their perfect lie. Before I tell you how I brought a wealthy dynasty to its knees without speaking a single word, please hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like an outsider in your own home. The heavy door of my sedan slammed shut and instantly severed the connection between me and the jazz music floating from the garden. I sat there for a long moment with my hands gripping the leather steering wheel while the engine hummed beneath me. This car was the only thing I possessed that I had paid for entirely with my own salary, unlike the leased luxury SUVs my parents drove to maintain their fragile appearances. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to remember the exhausting reality of the last 5 years, where I had quietly funneled every spare dollar from my salary as a compliance officer into the family logistics company to keep it afloat. I had risked my professional reputation to secure loans they did not qualify for, and I had spent countless nights balancing books that were bleeding money due to their sheer incompetence. They believed the company was thriving because of their leadership, but in reality, it was only surviving because I refused to let it fail. That era of blind loyalty ended tonight. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed the number for the high-end catering service managing the anniversary party. The owner answered on the second ring, expecting a compliment on the appetizers, but I cut him off before he could speak to ensure he understood the gravity of the situation. I kept my voice steady and professional as I delivered the instruction that would humiliate my family in front of their elite guests. "I am Kendra Vance Platinum Card holder ending in 8890. I want to report the transaction currently taking place at the Vance estate as unauthorized. Stop running the card and revoke all services immediately." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the frantic sound of shuffling papers as the owner tried to process what I had just ordered. I clarified that I was the sole owner of the account, and that any further charges would be disputed as fraud, which legally obligated him to stop serving immediately. He stammered a nervous apology and promised to alert his floor manager right away to halt the operations. I hung up the phone without waiting for his reassurance, because I knew the law was on my side and the consequences would be immediate. The next step required surgical precision because I knew my parents had access to my secondary checking account for what they called emergency household expenses. I opened my banking app and watched the facial recognition log me into the dashboard where the numbers stared back at me. I initiated a transfer of every single cent from my savings and checking accounts into a high-yield trust account I had opened last week under a separate entity. My fingers moved across the screen with practiced speed as I drained the liquidity that had funded their country club memberships and designer wardrobes for far too long. The screen flashed a green confirmation checkmark indicating that the transfer was complete, and the Vance family safety net was officially gone. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction watching the balance on the shared account drop to zero, which meant their cards would be declined the next time they tried to swipe. A notification banner dropped down from the top of my screen just as I put the car into drive and prepared to leave the property. It was a message from my cousin Jared, who was one of the few relatives I actually tolerated because he saw through the family facade. The text was short, but it confirmed that my instructions to the caterer had been executed with brutal efficiency. He wrote that the bartenders had just stopped pouring drinks, and the servers were beginning to clear the buffet tables while guests looked around in confusion. The music had stopped abruptly, and the atmosphere was shifting from celebration to panic as the staff began to pack up their equipment. I did not reply to him because I did not want to leave a digital trail of my satisfaction or give anyone a reason to accuse me of gloating. I merged onto the highway leading away from Lexington and watched the lights of the estate fade in the rearview mirror until they were swallowed by the darkness. A strange sensation washed over me that felt unfamiliar at first, until I realized it was genuine relief. For the first time in a decade, I was not driving toward a crisis I had to fix or a mess I had to clean up for people who resented me. I was driving toward a future where my hard work would finally benefit the person who actually earned it without being drained by parasites. The bridge was burned, and I had no intention of turning back to put out the fire. I turned up the radio and let the music drown out the phantom voices of my family as I sped toward freedom. The clock struck 8:30 in the evening, which should have been the moment for the celebratory cake cutting, but at the Vance estate it marked the arrival of financial disaster. The live jazz band fell silent abruptly because the lead catering manager signaled them to stop playing immediately. The sudden silence that descended over the manicured garden was heavy and uncomfortable, as guests looked around in confusion while holding their empty glasses. The catering manager marched past the confused waiters and approached the head table where my father Robert was holding court with a group of potential investors. Robert looked down at the interruption with the arrogant disdain he reserved for service staff and demanded to know why the entertainment had ceased without his permission. The manager did not flinch under my father's glare as he placed a portable credit card terminal on the white linen tablecloth. He spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear that the primary card on file had been declined for the remaining balance of $25,000. Robert laughed nervously and tried to dismiss the situation with a wave of his hand, as if it were a trivial misunderstanding. He leaned back in his chair and told the manager that there must be a glitch in their cheap little machine, because Vance never had issues with credit limits. He ordered the man to run the card again and to stop embarrassing himself before he lost his contract with our company. The manager stood his ground and explained that they had attempted to process the payment 3 times using different terminals, and the result was identical every single time. He insisted that unless the balance was settled immediately via cash or a verified wire transfer, the staff would begin packing up the food and leaving the premises. The color began to drain from Robert's face as he realized that his bluster was not working on a man who simply wanted to be paid for his services. My mother Linda, sensing the rising tension and the wandering eyes of their wealthy guests, grabbed her designer handbag from the floor. She smiled tightly at the people watching them, while she frantically dug through the contents of her purse to find a backup method of payment. She pulled out a sleek black wallet and retrieved 3 different credit cards that she carried for emergencies and prestigious appearances. She handed them to the manager one by one with a trembling hand, while maintaining a facade of annoyed inconvenience. The manager swiped the first card, and the machine beeped a harsh rejection sound that echoed in the quiet garden. He swiped the second card and then the third card, but each attempt resulted in the same red error light flashing on the small screen. Linda did not realize that every single card she possessed was a supplementary user card attached to the main corporate account I had frozen just 30 minutes prior. The manager finally lost his professional patience after the third decline and looked directly at my parents, who were now shrinking in their seats. He raised his voice to ensure that everyone in the vicinity understood exactly why the party was ending prematurely. Mr. Robert, the system shows the card is locked due to the owner reporting theft. If payment isn't made immediately, I'll have to call the police for theft of services. My sister's fiancé, Preston, was standing near the edge of the terrace holding a glass of champagne that suddenly felt very heavy in his hand. He was a shrewd businessman who had been led to believe that he was marrying into a dynasty of immense wealth and influence. He watched as his future father-in-law turned a shade of crimson while being threatened with police action over a catering bill. He saw the panic in Linda's eyes as she dumped the contents of her purse onto the table in a desperate search for cash that did not exist. For the first time since he met the Vance family, the illusion of their grandeur cracked wide open to reveal the chaotic instability underneath. My sister Courtney saw the change in Preston's expression and immediately rushed over to him, grabbing his arm with a grip that was too tight to be casual. She tried to laugh it off by whispering that it was just a ridiculous administrative error caused by the incompetent bank staff. She insisted that her father would have the bank manager fired the next morning for this humiliation and tried to pull Preston back toward the dance floor. Preston gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm and took a deliberate step backward to create physical distance between himself and the drama. He told her quietly that banks did not decline multiple cards for theft unless the account holder triggered it, and then he turned away to check his phone. The humiliation was absolute as the catering staff began stripping the tablecloths while guests were still standing around them. The wealthy attendees exchanged whispers and sympathetic glances that were laced with judgment as they began to drift toward the exit. They did not say goodbye to the hosts, but simply hurried to their cars to escape the awkwardness of a failed social event. Within 20 minutes, the garden was empty except for the piles of dirty dishes and my parents standing amidst the wreckage of their reputation. The next morning, I drove to the headquarters of Vance Global Logistics earlier than usual, not to work, but to put a permanent end to my career there. The parking lot was empty except for the security guard who waved at me with a smile that I knew would disappear once the chaos started. I walked through the glass doors into the silence of the building that I had single-handedly modernized over the last half-decade. I went straight to my corner office and began silently placing my personal belongings into a cardboard box, including the framed equine transport certifications that legally allowed this company to operate across international borders. These were not just decorations on the wall, but federal licenses issued specifically to me as the certified compliance officer for the transport of livestock. Without my name attached to the building, the entire operation was nothing more than a glorified trucking company with no authority to move thoroughbreds. I opened my laptop for the final time and composed a priority email addressed to our international shipping partners and every key employee in the building. The subject line was stark and professional to ensure it would be opened immediately by anyone who valued their job. The body of the email stated clearly that I was resigning effective immediately and that I was revoking my liability for all pending shipments. I hit send and watched the progress bar complete the action that would sever my legal ties to the disaster my family was about to create. I felt a strange sense of finality as I closed the laptop and placed it on the desk, which was now stripped of any personal touch. Robert stormed into the room with a face flushed red from a combination of a hangover and residual rage over the humiliated anniversary party. He marched toward my desk with his finger pointed in the air, ready to launch into a tirade about my disrespect and the frozen credit cards. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the cardboard box on my desk and the bare walls where my diplomas used to hang. He blinked in confusion as if he could not process the idea that I was actually leaving instead of waiting for his forgiveness. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but the sound of heavy footsteps running down the hallway cut him off before he could speak. The head operations manager burst into my office without knocking, and he looked on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was holding a tablet that was flashing urgent red notifications, and he did not even acknowledge my father's presence at first. He rushed to the side of my desk and frantically explained that the Port Authority in Miami had just flagged our morning containers. These were climate-controlled units carrying prize-winning Arabian horses worth millions of dollars, and they were currently sitting on the tarmac in the baking sun. Mr. Robert. The shipment to Dubai is being held at the port. The system is demanding an admin level 5 password to unlock the customs forms, or we will be fined $50,000 a day. Robert turned pale as the reality of the situation crashed into his arrogance like a freight train. He pushed past me and hammered his fingers onto my keyboard with the confidence of a man who believed being the owner meant he understood the machinery. He stared at the login screen, which demanded a 64-character encryption key that I generated fresh every single week. He tried typing in his own name, and then he tried the generic company password, but the screen simply shuttered and remained locked. He looked up at the operations manager with a mixture of fear and confusion because he realized he did not even know the name of the software, let alone the code to bypass it. The office phone began to ring with a shrill tone that signaled an international call from a very angry client. Then the landline on the manager's desk started ringing, and within seconds the entire floor was echoing with the sound of incoming complaints. Robert looked at me with desperate eyes and silently begged me to sit back down and fix the mess with my magic fingers. I simply picked up my box of personal effects and walked past them without offering a single word of advice or a scrap of pity. I stepped out of the office and walked down the hallway, while the cacophony of ringing phones and shouting voices faded behind me. By late afternoon, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop reviewing the termination clauses of my employment contract when my phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden table. I flipped the screen over to see a cascade of notifications from Instagram and Facebook, where Courtney had tagged me in a live video broadcast. I plugged in my earphones and watched as she sat in her walk-in closet with perfectly applied waterproof mascara running down her cheeks. She was telling her thousands of followers that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown caused by jealousy and had emptied the company accounts before disappearing. She claimed that our elderly parents were now left with nothing to pay for their medical bills because I had stolen their retirement funds to finance a secret life. The performance was theatrical, and she paused dramatically to wipe away tears while creating a narrative that painted me as a villain who hated her own flesh and blood. The comment section was filling up rapidly with messages of support for her and vitriolic hatred directed at me from people who had never met me. Mutual friends and even some of our extended family members were leaving heart emojis and calling me a monster for abandoning the people who raised me. I felt a surge of nausea rising in my throat as I watched her sob into the camera while wearing a diamond necklace that I knew for a fact was bought with the company credit card. I did not type a rebuttal or engage with the trolls because I knew that arguing with a liar in public only gave them more content to manipulate. I closed the app and immediately dialed the number of the one person who needed to see the truth before it was too late. I sent a text to Courtney's fiancé Preston asking him to meet me at my lawyer's office if he wanted to know where his investment money had actually gone. I arranged to meet him at the downtown office of my personal attorney because I wanted there to be witnesses to our conversation and a sterile environment. He arrived 20 minutes late, looking exhausted and wary, as if he expected me to launch into a defensive screaming match similar to the one he had witnessed at the party. I did not offer him coffee or small talk, but instead slid a heavy black binder across the polished mahogany conference table. Inside were 5 years of certified bank statements that detailed exactly where every dollar of the Vance family fortune had come from and where it had gone. I opened the file to the section labeled Courtney's Personal Expenditures and watched his eyes widen as he saw the rows of red ink that represented her spending habits. He began to flip through the pages, and his confusion turned to horror as he realized that the successful interior design business Courtney claimed to run was actually a shell entity funded entirely by my salary and loans, taken out in his name. I pointed to a specific series of transactions from last month that totaled nearly $50,000, which she had claimed were donations to an orphanage in Europe. The bank codes clearly indicated luxury boutiques and five-star hotels, rather than any charitable organization. I leaned forward and tapped my finger on the highlighted entry to ensure he understood the magnitude of her deception. Look closely at this expense. The money Courtney said was for charity was actually shopping bills in Milan and Paris under your name. Preston stared at the document for a long time while the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sick. He traced the dates of the transactions and realized they coincided perfectly with the humanitarian trips she had taken with her friends while he was working. He had believed he was marrying a philanthropist with a kind heart, but the paper trail proved he was engaged to a pathological liar who used his credit rating as her personal piggy bank. The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of his shattering illusions as he processed the fact that his future wife was a fraud. He looked up at me with eyes that were no longer suspicious, but filled with a profound sense of betrayal. He did not yell or deny the evidence, but simply closed the binder with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. He asked me in a quiet voice if he could take the file with him to verify the account numbers with his own forensic accountant. I nodded my permission because I knew that once he pulled that thread, the entire tapestry of lies Courtney had woven would unravel completely. He stood up and walked out of the office without saying goodbye, but I noticed he was walking with the heaviness of a man who just lost his future. This was the first crack in the perfect image Courtney had built, and I knew it would not be the last. 2 days after I left, the shiny veneer of the Vance family began to peel away rapidly without my cash flow and management to hold it together. The first sign of their new reality hit them when the air conditioning in the main dining room sputtered and died during breakfast service. I had canceled the automatic payments for the electricity and water, which were registered in my name, to protect my credit score from their negligence. My parents found themselves sitting in a silent house that was rapidly heating up under the Kentucky sun, while the security system beeped a low battery warning. They tried to call the utility company to demand an explanation, but were told that the account had been closed by the primary holder and a new deposit of $5,000 was required to restore service. My brother Travis felt the squeeze of poverty faster than anyone else because his allowance had evaporated the moment I froze the accounts. He was already deep in debt to some dangerous people from his gambling habits, and without my hush money, he became desperate. He drove to the logistics office late at night and began loading high-end computers and printers into the back of his truck to sell at a pawn shop. He did not realize that I had installed silent motion sensors that alerted the local police immediately instead of sending a notification to my father's phone. He managed to escape before the patrol cars arrived, but he left behind security footage that would eventually be his undoing when the police reviewed the tapes. The administrative collapse continued when a certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service arrived at the front desk of the company the next morning. It was a notification of an immediate field audit triggered by the irregular financial reports my father had attempted to file after I locked him out of the main system. He had tried to manipulate the numbers to hide the losses from the failed Dubai shipment, but his amateur accounting raised red flags instantly. The letter stated that federal agents would be arriving within 48 hours to seize physical records and interview the corporate officers regarding suspected tax fraud. My father stared at the document with trembling hands because he knew that, without me to explain the deductions, he was looking at prison time. The chaos reached a fever pitch when a dark sedan pulled up to the gates of the estate and 2 men in suits walked up the driveway. My mother Linda was watching from the window, and she realized too late that these were not guests, but process servers from the bank holding the mortgage. She watched in horror as they taped a bright orange notice of foreclosure directly onto the mahogany front door, because the payments were 3 months behind without my hidden transfers. She grabbed her phone and dialed my father in a panic while her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the device. "Robert, there are men from the bank taping a foreclosure notice to the front door right now. They say we violated the mortgage terms and have to vacate. You need to come home immediately." The final blow came in the form of a courier delivery from my personal attorney that was handed directly to my mother while she was still crying on the porch. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the property based on the fact that the deed to the estate was legally in my name. I had bought the house from them 5 years ago to save them from bankruptcy and allowed them to live there rent-free as tenants at will. That agreement was now terminated due to their hostile behavior, and they were facing homelessness in addition to legal prosecution. The courier did not offer any sympathy as he took a photo of the delivery to prove that they had been served. The reality of their situation sank in as night fell over the mansion, which was now pitch black without electricity. They sat in the living room by candlelight, realizing that they could not survive a single week without the financial umbrella I had provided for a decade. My sister Courtney refused to accept defeat, and instead hatched a plan to manipulate me one last time using their greatest weapon against me. She convinced our parents to stage an intervention where they would apologize for everything and beg for my forgiveness to lure me back into the fold. It was not a genuine attempt at reconciliation, but a calculated emotional trap designed to get my signature on a loan guarantee. She believed that if they cried hard enough, I would forget the humiliation and sign my life away again to save the family image. On Friday evening, I returned to the darkened family estate not to offer a truce, but to witness the final act of their desperate performance. I stepped into the cavernous living room, which was illuminated only by the flickering light of expensive scented candles because the electricity remained disconnected due to non-payment. My parents and siblings were sitting in a semicircle on the plush velvet sofas, wearing expressions of carefully rehearsed sorrow that seemed to vanish the moment they saw me standing there. My mother launched into her performance immediately by sobbing into a lace handkerchief and wailing about the sanctity of blood ties that I was threatening to sever with my cold-hearted legal actions. She reached out her trembling hands to beg me not to sell the home they had raised us in and graciously offered to reinstate me as the compliance director if I agreed to settle the outstanding debts immediately. I stood near the doorway without removing my coat because I wanted them to understand that I was merely a visitor in a house I legally owned and was preparing to sell. I looked at my mother with a cold detachment and told her clearly that their tears were shedding for the loss of their luxurious lifestyle rather than for the years of mistreatment they had inflicted upon me. I pulled a thick manila folder from my bag and tossed it onto the coffee table where it landed with a heavy thud amidst the elegant candle arrangements. I revealed that I had full documentation showing how they had drained the company accounts to bribe the local prosecutor into burying Travis's grand larceny charges 3 years ago. Travis shrank back into the shadows of the sofa while I turned my gaze to Courtney, who was sitting quietly in the corner trying to look innocent. I exposed the printed text logs proving she had been sleeping with her high school boyfriend throughout her entire engagement to Preston, while using Preston's money to fund their trysts. The room fell into a terrified silence as the weight of their secrets suffocated the last remnants of their dignity and exposed them as frauds. My father Robert attempted to stand up to assert his authority, but he sank back down when he saw the look of absolute resolve in my eyes. I took a deliberate step closer to him to ensure he heard every word of the sentence that would dismantle his remaining hope. I am not coming back to save this hollow shell of a family. I came here to announce that Preston is standing right outside the open door, and he has heard absolutely everything you just admitted. Preston stepped out from the shadows of the hallway where I had positioned him before entering the room, and his face was a mask of pure disgust and betrayal. He did not look at Courtney as he verbally terminated their engagement and demanded the immediate return of the 3-carat diamond ring he had placed on her finger. The sound of Courtney's shrill scream echoed against the high ceilings as she realized her ticket to a wealthy future had just walked out the door forever. I turned my back on the cacophony of blaming and weeping to walk out into the cool night air for the very last time, knowing I was finally free. 6 months have passed since that fateful night, and justice was finally served in the most brutal way reality could offer. The once prestigious Vance global logistics empire has completely collapsed under the weight of its own corruption and was auctioned off piece by the bank last week to pay off the massive tax liens. I stood in the back of the auction hall watching strangers bid pennies on the dollar for the office furniture and transport trucks that I had once worked so hard to maintain. The building that my father used to strut through like a king is now stripped bare and boarded up pending a complete demolition by the new owners. My parents are currently living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town where the peeling wallpaper is a daily reminder of the luxury they squandered. They spend their days arguing loudly enough for the neighbors to hear while blaming each other for the downfall, because neither can accept that their arrogance was the true cause. Travis is currently serving a 2-year sentence in a state correctional facility because he was foolish enough to be caught stealing corporate assets after the federal seizure order was in place. He thought he could sneak into the warehouse to take the copper wiring and server equipment to sell for quick cash, but the FBI was already watching the property. He is no longer the arrogant young man who laughed at me in the family photo, but simply inmate number 409, who spends his days cleaning the cafeteria. My sister Courtney suffered the most public humiliation of all, because the high society she desperately tried to impress has completely exiled her for her fraudulent behavior. She is currently working long shifts at a local nail salon to pay off her credit card debt, and she has to serve the very women she used to look down upon. I walked past the salon window last week and saw her kneeling to scrub a customer's feet with a look of utter defeat on her face. I have since opened my own boutique consulting firm specializing in equine transport compliance, and I finally wake up every morning in a house that is filled with peace instead of demands. I did not need their money or their approval to be successful, because my value was never tied to their validation. I built a life that is authentically mine, and I sleep soundly, knowing that the people who tried to break me ultimately only succeeded in breaking themselves. Before we end the story today, do not scroll away, because there is a crucial lesson here that we need to discuss. This story illustrates that true power in a family dynamic does not come from being the loudest person in the room or the one wearing the most expensive clothes. The real power belongs to the person who holds the competence and the financial independence to walk away when they are being mistreated. Kendra teaches us that setting boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of self-preservation. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm, even if those people are your parents or siblings. When you allow people to disrespect you without consequences, you are essentially teaching them how to treat you. I want to hear your honest perspective on this situation because it is definitely a controversial topic for many families. If you were in Kendra's position, would you have walked out of the photo immediately, or would you have tried to have a conversation first? Do you think her revenge went too far, or did her family get exactly what they deserved? Please share your thoughts in the comments below because I read every single one. Thank you so much for listening to the end, and please subscribe for more stories